Over the past few weeks, Cyberpunk 2077 has been getting a lot of justified criticism. The game has a lot of problems and the studio behind the game seems to have just as many issues as the game itself does. From performance issues resulting in blanket refunds for console players to bugs affecting AI and immersion, and of course all the hype and wankery behind the game's overblown marketing campaign. There's a lot to take in, there's a lot to complain about, and there's certainly a lot for CD Projekt Red to fix. But I've already droned on plenty about what's wrong with both the game and CD Projekt Red. This video is not about that. On the contrary, this video aims to defend CD Projekt Red against what I think are frivolous claims against them. Claims that serve no purpose other than to spread manufactured outrage and generate cheap clicks for the outlets and individuals spreading them. There are, at least for now, two claims in particular I wish to talk about. One is being regurgitated in almost every second post about Cyberpunk on social media sites like Twitter or Reddit. And the other is an asinine complaint from a somewhat well-known New Zealand media website that honestly does this shit all the time and really needs to be held accountable every time it does, as all media should be. The first claim is that Cyberpunk 2077 is not a role-playing game, and a primary source for this is that only a few months ago CD Projekt started removing the RPG label from the marketing in favour of an action-adventure label instead, including on their Twitter. While this topic has seen some revival what with the actual release of the game, this argument was being made as far back as a year ago on so-called news sites like Game Pressure. To cut to the chase, I quite obviously consider this argument completely bogus. Now yes, I will obviously contend that per their own marketing wank, the game is not as deep as it should be or even as open as the studio themselves marketed it would be. I agree that yes, it is nowhere close to being a deeper experience than The Witcher 3, nor is it the
most believable city in any open world game to date.
I have made at least 2 videos criticizing such claims and I am not backtracking on those statements now. However, my problem isn't that Cyberpunk isn't as compelling an RPG as they hyped, but that some people seem to think it isn't an RPG at all. And so far, the primary argument seems to be that they relabeled it as an action-adventure, which is weak and entirely unconvincing. The first problem I've run into is figuring out how people define the term role-playing game. Role-playing game is a phrase and as such not really found in most dictionaries, but from my perspective there are 2 primary definitions. The first is a game in which you play as a character and are then sent out on an adventure at least partially controlled by a game master. The second is any game in which you are role-playing, as defined by most dictionaries as the action of acting out or performing the part of a person or character. The difference being that the first definition is basically any pen and paper tabletop like Dungeons and Dragons and hinges entirely on the fact that you have someone else moderating your character's journey throughout the adventure, whilst the latter could be something as basic as you playing make-believe in your backyard. Role-playing video games have existed in some form or another since at least the 1980s, with numerous games based primarily on pen and paper board games of the time. Rogue, the granddaddy and namesake for all roguelikes, was made in 1980 and is generally considered a role-playing game, despite the fact it has no real story, no real dialogue, no real character development outside of gear. You could argue it's more an action role-playing game, but an ARPG is still an RPG. Then came games like Ultima and Wizardry, which did have stories and a sense of character development and narrative direction, but they don't have a game master, a human being to control the plot, the dungeons, the puzzles, the combat, etc. They're all pre-programmed adventures that have a set amount of variables of how your character can develop, and virtually every role-playing game since then is like that. Both Ultima and Wizardry would go on to form the blueprints for games such as Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy, both being part of the genre known as Japanese role-playing games. Still an RPG. Even Pokemon is a JRPG, it just generally has far less focus on the narrative than others do. The fact is, the common similarity between virtually all role-playing video games and the pen and paper equivalent is the fact that you are controlling and playing as a character, and that character gets stronger in some way throughout the journey, either via an overarching storyline or by gameplay mechanics like gearing, perks, leveling up, etc. The only word with an actual definition here is role-playing, and all that means is to act out or perform a role. And so as to not confuse your average story-based first-person shooter with an RPG, we tend to add things like exploration and quests, items and inventory, character actions and abilities, experience and levels, etc, etc. Virtually all major role-playing games from the original Baldur's Gate to the Elder Scrolls V have most of these systems to some degree, and Cyberpunk 2077 is far from being an exception. Now, One could argue games like Doom or the latest Call of Duty are role-playing games because you play a role and they have some sort of upgrade system. My response is, sure, why not? Genres are more like a scale and not a fixed label we staple onto the side of things and forget about. Generalizations can make it easy to filter and search out specific topics at a glance, but are often not entirely accurate. The point here isn't whether other games are RPGs or not, but whether Cyberpunk isn't. Personally, my litmus test for most of these kinds of things is what could the average consumer expect if they looked it up on Google? If someone just went on Google and searched role-playing games, what results would they get? Well, using a VPN and Microsoft Edge, a browser not even my fucking grandmother uses, I get results such as Dungeons & Dragons, Cyberpunk, The Witcher 3, and Skyrim. If I look up just the term RPG, I give it even more classic video games like Fallout, World of Warcraft, Mass Effect, and even Deus Ex. Every single one of these being generally classified by most people as a role-playing game. So you're telling me Cyberpunk lost the right to be called an RPG, all because their PR team removed it on Twitter in what is quite obviously a successful attempt at derailing the conversation to something other than the game being shit? Alrighty then, whatever. So on to the second problem, the one involving a well-known but totally bullshit mainstream media outlet in New Zealand. Sometime last week, stuff.co.nz ran an article claiming that the use of a moko in Cyberpunk 2077 was definitely appropriation. The claims being made by one Morgana Watson, head of a gaming studio you've never heard anything about, probably won't hear anything about, and who as far as I can tell haven't actually made any games, don't have an official website, aren't on the official New Zealand Companies Registrar, and who I won't give much attention to because they're clearly pining for it. My issue is with a major news network like Stuff actually running this garbage. Cultural appropriation. Are we really still on this topic? By that logic, rugby, which is the national sport of New Zealand, is guilty of it. Rugby was originally an English sport, as in coming from the United Kingdom, and our leading sports team has adopted the use of the haka, a ceremonial dance or challenge in Māori culture. So we've got a Western sport using a Māori dance. Sounds like cultural appropriation to me! Ugh, fuck, God. Look, the debate has always been where the line between appropriation and exchange begins and ends, because the former is considered negative while the latter positive. But from an outsider looking in, the two can often look the same. The basics of every human civilization, every nation on Earth, is synthesis. Humanity, especially in the modern era, is not authentic, monolithic, singular, or dare I say it, pure. Look at Western society, for instance. Our numbers are Arabic. Our alphabet is Latin. We have so many religions, many of varying non-English origins. We have adopted the sciences and philosophies of the Greek, who themselves adopted some of theirs from the Romans, who adopted theirs from someone else. It's basic history. Art, music, technology, every single one of these has an inspiration or starting point that exists outside your own origins, and nobody thinks that's wrong. So why, suddenly, is using a Māori tattoo culturally offensive, particularly when it's not using it in any offensive or otherwise outstanding way? Oh, that's right, it's because it's the fucking news, and the only things that matter these days is clicks and engagement. Oh boy, all of this, and I haven't even mentioned the real problem with the article. The tattoo in Cyberpunk isn't a moko. Huh! Holy crap! So what is it? It's artistically similar, but symbolically completely different. It's a kirituhi. Moko is uniquely Māori, to be done by Māori for Māori people. It is symbolic and has cultural significance, but a kirituhi is simply a Māori-inspired tattoo that can be done by anyone, but lacks the cultural meaning. The word literally means skin art, and is used precisely to differentiate between Māori-style tattoos and moko. Similar, yes, but not the same, and certainly far from being whatever the fuck cultural appropriation is. Now look, I'm not about to profess myself as someone experienced in Maori culture. I'm just another privileged white fuck making videos on the internet. But everything I'm saying can be found online with a few simple Google searches. It really isn't all that hard. I'm tired of bullshit news organizations spreading their complete masturbatory artificial outrage when there's plenty of actual outrage we could be bitching about instead. Look, I'm not a big fan of CDPR right now either. But Cyberpunk has so many things wrong with it, many perfectly legitimate and well-documented complaints, that we really need and focus on redefining a word that has existed for the better part of 4 decades. I get that some people might not care about this as strongly as I do even, but I'm personally not fond of any kind of misinformation. I'm not going to sit here and chide CD Projekt Red for engaging in that behavior and then turn around and do it myself. That is supremely hypocritical and completely undermines any and all arguments I hope to make against them. As always, my friends, that's it from me. My name is Mr. Tastix, and if you happen to like this kind of crap, then smash the like and subscribe button, and I'll see you next week.